Hello, everybody. Recording has started. We are so grateful for Dr. Cantu's presentation, and we've been excitedly waiting for this. Please know that at the end of her presentation, we'll be sending your information off, and you will be receiving a 5-post question to this presentation. Once you answer those questions, you will receive your CEUs. And we will remind you of this at the end of the presentation. And out of respect to Dr. Cantu, I will start presenting.
Thank you, Beth. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you virtually. As I get started on this presentation, it is a rather large presentation just in ways of animation, etc. So I am going to go off video, but I wasn't quite sure if you could see me anyway. So just to let you know that. Secondly, is I have my window open to try to enjoy the morning. If the birds get too much, please let me know. And I will certainly close the window. I have some of the old operable windows, so it's nice to lift them up at times when it's a beautiful day. So with that being said, let me get off camera and we'll get started. And Beth will go ahead and move the slide for me. So Beth, if you could, this workshop is going to be on advancing the climate change into the nursing curriculum and ways that you might be able to bring this in to some of your topics with the nursing students. So we'll go ahead and proceed. Beth, next slide. So at Learning Objectives today, first of all, I want to spend the first part of this talking about the science of climate change in its current state. And I understand that some may be aware of it, but I was trying to start out with just that basic so everybody knows what we're talking about. And then what's the connection between health and climate change, particularly public health, the impact on children's health, elder health, and then mental health. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from the 2018 report from the Lancet journal, Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. They say climate change is actually the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. Next slide. Another quote that just came out fairly recently, the science is unequivocal, a global increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial average and the continued loss of biodiversity risk is catastrophic to human health, and it will be impossible to reverse. And this was in September of last year. And this was a joint statement of all the leading medical journals. So again, just there's that momentum there from medical journals, from physicians, from other scientists that this is a harm to public health. Next slide. And I'm going to spend this first part of the presentation looking at these 4 dynamics of climate change. It's the rising temperatures, rising water levels, or sea levels, I should say, increasing carbon dioxide levels, and then extreme weather events. And from those 4 activities that are a result of climate change, you have an impact on air pollution, severe weather, extreme heat, environmental degradation, water and food supply, water quality impacts, increasing allergens, and the changes in vector ecology. And all of those then on the outside of the circle cause and contribute to these factors that we see: asthma, cardiovascular disease, injuries, mental health disorders. And so again, that's the impact of climate change on human health. So I'm going to kind of dive in to say what about climate change is leading to some of those illnesses and some of those exacerbation of the illnesses and chronic diseases that we see. Next slide. So just the science of climate change, and it's pretty well known by now. This is a photo of the sun shining over Earth's horizon through the 2 lowermost layers of the atmosphere, and that's the troposphere and the stratosphere. Next slide. So what happens is that the Earth absorbs the energy that's radiated from the sun, and the solar radiation in the form of light waves comes into the Earth, passes through the atmosphere, and some of the heat energy in the form of that radiation is then radiated back out to space. Next slide, please. So it's absorbed by the Earth, it warms it. Next slide. And then you can see that some of it is radiated back out to Earth, which is good. That's what you want. That natural layer of the greenhouse gases. Some of it is trapped in the atmosphere to warm the Earth. There's a very good. That's a very good thing, because that's what has kept the temperatures here on Earth within tolerable boundaries, and has given rise to the flourishing of all of the many life forms that we have on Earth. So you have some coming into Earth, warming the Earth, and then some radiating back out into outer space. That is good. Next slide, please. And because the atmosphere is getting thicker, that's the problem, is that instead of it radiating back out into space, more of it is being trapped and radiated back into the onto the Earth. We're thickening this natural greenhouse gas layer that we have in the atmosphere, and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and so that outgoing radiation gets trapped and it comes back to Earth and continues to warm the Earth, global warming, if you will. That's what our climate crisis is. That's really the essential cause of all the problems that we're having to deal with now. So why is it getting thicker? And I apologize, I should have said at the very beginning, if you have any questions whatsoever, please let me know. Informal, just let me know if there's a question, and then when I stop through before break, any questions at that, but please let me know. Next slide, please. Okay, and you can see, I'm sorry, you can continue seeing it getting trapped, and you can see the atmosphere thickening up. So that's it. That's really, like I said, the basic of it. You got a thicker atmosphere and more of that coming to warm the Earth. Next slide. So what we do know is that since World War II, the largest source of global warming, that infrared not being able to get back out into outer space, is the burning of fossil fuels. And as you see that from this graph, you can see how much the fossil fuels have been burned since the World War II. Now, a lot of that was a lot more industry was developed, a lot more of that burning of fossil fuels. So it kind of goes along with the advent of more businesses, more homes being built, population growth, etc. But you can see how high that growth. So if you look at this image and see after World War II, how the use of fossil fuels has just gone up so rapidly. And each molecule of carbon dioxide on average, which is a fossil fuel, and the burning of carbon dioxide on average stays in the atmosphere for about 100 years, and it traps heat for all of that time. So the molecule's trapping the heat for at least 100 years. So the burning of fossil fuel not only has an impact now, but has an impact into the future. Next slide. So when you burn fossil fuels, you get the greenhouse gases. And here are the big three. There are more, but with all the science going behind what's creating climate change, these are the big three greenhouse gases that trap the most heat. So that's why they call them the big three. Carbon dioxide, emitted whenever coal, natural gas, oil is burned, and it's the largest contributor because it is just so common. It's everywhere. It's not the most powerful greenhouse gas, but it is the largest contributor just because it is so common. In order to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, we need to think about how do we reduce some of the use of it, the current use of it. So carbon dioxide is one. Then you have methane. Now, this is caused by the decomposition of plant matter and is released from landfills, swamps, and rice paddies. Not many rice paddies here, but we certainly do have a lot of landfills, not swamp, not in at least this part of Texas, more in East Texas. But we certainly do have our share of landfills. But we also have methane emitted from cattle. The methane gas that's emitted from cattle. It's a major greenhouse gas, as each molecule of methane has 25 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide. So methane is even more heat trapping, if you will. The molecule contains more intense heat. And then we have nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is released from bacteria in the soil. Modern architectural practices, tilling, soiling, livestock waste management, and the use of nitrogen-rich fertilizers. Those are all contributors to nitrous oxide going into the atmosphere. One molecule has 298 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So there's additional ones. These are the big the big three: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. So if we just think about controlling those three, we would go a long way in eliminating what's happening to thicken that atmosphere, that we retain more heat. Next slide, please. Okay, so where are the fossil fuels coming from? We live here in Texas. We can see some of this at a big source here in Texas, but all over the country too. Oil production. We have certainly the fracking that's surrounding San Antonio in some of the rural counties, Karnes County, Wilson County, etc. So we have oil production, and natural gas production. Fertilization happens because we have a lot of farms, we have a lot of ranches here. We certainly have agriculture, industrial agriculture around, industrial processes, coal burning plants we have here in San Antonio. We have two remaining. CPS did close one coal plant back in 2018. We still have two burning here in San Antonio, Spruce 1 and Spruce 2. Right now, CPS is on target to close them down by 2050. But we do have that source here in San Antonio, and coal mining as well. Well, we don't have coal mining, but coal mining is another source of these emissions. So a lot of ways that these molecules get into the environment, into the air, and therefore helping to thicken up that atmosphere. There are, so you can see there are many, many sources for this. Next slide, please. And this is just a graph to show you that 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2002. The 5 hottest of all have been in the last 5 years, in fact. And I just heard, I believe it was last week, that San Antonio had the warmest December on record, last December of 2021. And it was, I think I was wearing shorts on Christmas Day, and maybe many of you were as well. So you can see that something is happening to create some of this intense heat that we've been seeing over and over and over again. Next slide, please. Oh, 7 years. I'm sorry. I should say the hottest of all have been in the last 7 years. Next slide. And this is another way of looking at it. So from 1880 to 2020, definitely a departure from the average in terms of looking at global surface temperature. That's driving the air temperature up. This past year was the hottest year ever recorded, with instruments narrowly beating 2016. And this pattern is extremely clear that this is happening. Next slide, please. Do you remember last year, the Pacific Northwest, and Dr. Salt, I think you're on, and your family is in Seattle, some of the hottest temperatures on record. This was the most anomalous event ever measured in the Pacific Northwest of North America. It even went up higher temperatures all the way up to British Columbia. And so this is just a map showing what happened in the Pacific Northwest, a heat wave. And again, that is an area where people don't necessarily have air conditioners, are not used to living in that heat that we here in Texas may be used to, or at least somewhat used to. But next slide, please. Dr. Salt, do you have a question?
No, I was just going to say that in two to three generations of my Norwegian family being on the peninsula, they bought air conditioning this last year. First time ever.
Wow. Yeah. So something that we see the actions people are taking because they are seeing this intense heat. And not only in the United States, June through August of last year was Europe's hottest on record. Next slide. This is a picture taken in Italy last year. This was during their heat wave, 119 degrees was set in Sicily. And these women are holding up snails that actually died in their shells during this heat wave. Next slide. In Russia, Serbia, I always remember growing up and I was always threatened, well, we're going to send you to Serbia, all this snow and everything else. I think of that movie, Dr. Zhivago, and all the snow and everything else. But actually, in 2020, temperature in Serbia reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the northernmost 38-degree temperature ever recorded and the highest temperature on record in the Arctic. So then this was just in 2020. Next slide. Los Angeles, California, another all-time heat record was set. This was in September 2020, 121 degrees. I cannot remember that getting that hot here, 121, and we certainly may have. I just don't remember in my lifetime that happening. But this was just just a year and a half ago in Los Angeles, California. Next slide. Phoenix, Miami both experienced their hottest month ever, July of 2020. Next slide, please. France, 2020 that's the Europe's hottest on record in France, and you can see them trying to take advantage of some of their fountains there. Next slide. And in India, summer actually may soon be literally unbearable. This is a headline from the New York Times. In July of 2018, in India, that summer heat may soon be literally impossible for people to continue living there. So as you can see, this intense heat is really a multiplier, a threat multiplier, because people cannot live there. What do people do when they can't live there? They try to migrate to other places, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Next slide. Ghana. Same thing, 111 degrees. This was in 2020. Next slide, please. And I think you can go on because there'll be some graphics here. But yeah. So one thing that's really important, this is a different way of looking at the globe. We're looking at the Pacific Ocean. And this is just to highlight the fact that that extra heat that's not being able to get out of the atmosphere, not going back into outer space, is being trapped on Earth, but most of it is being trapped in the oceans. So 93% of that extra heat is actually trapped by man-made global warming into the ocean. So you have to step back and take that global look at that. So what happens when water gets warmer, when it gets hotter? What are some of the things that you see from that? Well, one of them is rising sea levels, because you're boiling water and your water expands. And then the other reason that you have rising sea levels is because many of those things in the Arctic, the Antarctic, the glaciers, the icebergs, they're melting. And so they're all contributing to rising sea levels. These rising sea levels have an impact, and there's the health impacts that we'll talk about later, but that's to understand why we do see some of that rising sea level. So next slide. Here is a graphic showing that the oceans are getting warmer. The last time I was down at the coast, the temperatures of the water was just very, very warm. They're continuing to get warmer and warmer. Next slide, please. And another graph showing how this is just rising exponentially in terms of rising sea levels, rising heat content, and the rising sea levels go right along with that. Next slide. How soon it's only occurred within the last 20 years. Again, that kind of goes along with what we're seeing with this intense heat. Here in Miami Beach, Florida, this was taken in 2016. This was during high tide. The reason that we're seeing an octopus in the parking lot is because of the melting of the ice, the rising the sea levels. So again, these greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. The planet is warming. Global mean sea level rise is happening 25% faster in the late 20th century. Next slide. And then this came across to me, this photo of a person in the island of Kiribati. This is a Pacific north of New Zealand, and the islands of the country of Kiribati actually was the first nation to have to purchase land in another country to house its climate refugees because of the climate that was rising. And I believe they did this in 2016. And I was researching it, and some of the people there are up in arms because the government now has decided to use that purchase of land for something else, to grow some food, because they are also a food insecure population. And so they're concerned if that land isn't available for them to migrate to as a whole island. So, but it was actually their initial intent in purchasing this land was to house those climate refugees that they knew would be happening because the sea level is rising. Okay, next slide. So as temperatures increase, the oceans evaporate more moisture into the sky. And this is important too, because we're going to be talking about some of those disasters that happen for us. So heat is evaporating. There's more moisture being put into the atmosphere, to the sky. So as temperatures increase, the oceans tend to evaporate more moisture into the sky. And another click about it might go. There's a graphic, yeah, because of, and that's creating the the precipitation, those really severe precipitation anomalies that we've been seeing. So if you look at the 2010 to 2016, those 100-year flood events that we've been hearing about, 1,000-year, 5,000-year weather events that rain events that we now see happen every year, is one of the consequences of all of the moisture going into rising up and going into the sky and being held in the atmosphere. Next slide. This is a photo in Phoenix, Arizona in 2016. So when we talk about these massive flood events, just the rain all at one time, this is what we're talking about. See, and you can just see how it just all came in. Next slide. And here is in Midland, Texas, another example of this. And you can see the pockets of it just falling. And we've been seeing more and more and more of these events, which contributes to flash flooding, drowning, flooding of the homes, damage from that. So more and more of these events are happening because you've got the atmosphere warming. More moisture is in the environment, is in the atmosphere, and you have a triggering event, and it all comes down at one time. Next slide, please. Venice, Italy, 6 times in the last 1,200 years, but 4 of those floods have occurred in the last 20 years. And so, in Venice, you're used to seeing, the water, the canals, but actually this went into St. Mark's Basilica as well. Next slide. And then as you see this goes, this is just happened last year. I think we all remember the flooding of Storm Elsa into the subways in New York City, going into the subway and people having to get themselves out of the subway system and protect themselves from drowning. Next slide. Tennessee, this was last year. March, heavy rains led to flooding across the Nashville area. Next slide. And this one I just included because sometimes you just can't make this up. There's a replica of Noah's Ark in Kentucky. They had a big downpour there and they just sued their insurance company for $1 million in damage, flood damages to the replicas of Noah's Ark. So again, it's like, oh, wow, just having to think about the dichotomy of that and being destroyed by flooding. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, and this one I thought was important as we think about, and we'll talk about health and how its impact on health. I was talking about the flooding, the intense heat. All of those contribute to disasters that we see, the flooding from disasters, the tornadoes, the hurricanes, etc. Next slide, please. I think this is more graphics in here. And so this slide will show that there are counties that are most vulnerable to disasters. Of these 10 counties rated most vulnerable by the CDC, the population is on average 81% persons of color. And as you see from this, I believe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those that have been identified are actually in Texas. And I think Dr. Salt and Dr. Grubasek, I think you were with us when we did some work with Hurricane Harvey and the disaster that created in the Rockport area. Now you see, so you see these disasters more and more happening more and more frequently, but the impact is where people of color, communities of color, low-income communities reside the most. So it's important to think about this as we think about some continued discussion about the health impacts of climate change. Okay, next slide. Louisiana here in 2019, flooding in that area disproportionately impacts the Black neighborhoods. Whenever there's flooding, it's generally in the area of low-income communities of color. Next slide. And this shows you a bit about Hurricane Harvey. And I think we're all intimately familiar with that because we did some work in 2017, 2018 with the Rockport area after the recovery from Hurricane Harvey. But when you look at it crossing waters in the Gulf of Mexico that were up 4 degrees centigrade or 7 degrees Fahrenheit higher than normal, up to 200 meters deep. And so when water is warmer, hurricanes like warmer water, so it becomes more active in terms of tropical storms, hurricanes that will make landfall. And as you see from the path of Harvey, this was what happened because you can see the graph there on the bottom right, how warm that area was when it made landfall, and then when it went on to Houston and created the rain event that it did. And the other thing to remember about Harvey, Houston, from Harvey is Houston is where a lot of industry is. It's a ship channel. There's a lot of chemical industry there. And actually Hurricane Harvey resulted in more than 100 toxic chemical releases, many in, of course, the low income areas of town, minority communities of color. So again, Hurricane Harvey was made more intense because of this heat, and this heat is a result of this trapping of the heat in our atmosphere. Next slide, please. Laura, the hurricane that happened in 2020, the strongest recorded hurricane ever to strike Louisiana, grew from a Category 1 to a Category 4 storm in a single day. And you can see the destruction of these homes. Next slide. Hurricane Delta happened in 2020. It intensified from a tropical depression to a category 4 in a record 36 hours. So again, very, very intense, very warm, hot waters, and it just regurgitates and creates that intensity when the hurricane does make landfall. Next slide. In Guatemala, in 2020, Hurricane Eta triggered mudslides that killed at least 50 people in Guatemala. Next slide. Nicaragua, same thing. That hurricane was quickly followed by Central America Hurricane Iota, another category 4 storm. And so this we'll be talking about later when we talk about people that are having to leave their cities, their towns. They have to migrate. They have to immigrate into other places because it is no longer their land is no longer inhabitable. They can't plant, etc. And so you see this happening in Central America. Next slide. Because of changes that are happening to the land due to this heavy rainfall and flooding, and we start coming into what we're thinking of maybe some food insecurity issues. Last year, we saw these downpours in the upper Midwest of the United States. It led to a situation where 20 million acres of prime farmland could not be planted. So again, you think about not planting, so there's a decrease in food production, food manufacturing, food production, contributing to some of the food insecurity that we're going to see more and more so as a result of these instances where land cannot be used to grow food any longer. Next slide. So the same extra heat that evaporates more water into the ocean, causing bigger downfalls, actually also pulls moisture from even more quickly from the soil, causing longer and deeper droughts. So you have two disasters that could result. All this rain coming down at one time, the flooding, and then you could also have droughts, and they happen because of the same mechanism that's putting heat in the atmosphere. It's doing two things. It's creating more downpours, plus it's taking it's evaporating from the soil and causing more droughts. So the droughts take hold more quickly, they drive deeper, and they last longer. And of course, this is creating huge problems with the land and with the people that inhabit the land. Next slide. September of last year, 93% of the U.S. West is experiencing moderate to exceptional drought. 6 states are 100% in drought. And as you can see, the darker one is California. I've been hearing a lot of stories about drought in California, but it also goes up into Washington and Oregon. And you have the Dakotas. No, I'm sorry, that's Wyoming. But you have a lot of the West now experiencing that drought that's happening, and they're lasting longer. Next slide. Nearly half of California exceptional drought conditions, as you can see from this graph. Next slide. In Brazil, Brazil's drought has cost up to $3 billion in damages in 2020. Next slide. And then, of course, the fires. The fires that we've been hearing about in California, in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. The largest one here in California, second largest in history, the Dixie Fire, destroyed most of the town of Greenville. And a lot of the drought is contributing to the dry conditions in which you just spark a match, and then the fire happens because of that. So drought, uninhabitable land, but it's also influences the start of wildfires, which we've been seeing a lot more of. Next slide. Oregon, at least 102,000 are what they call hectares, but acres of forest designed to provide carbon offsets in major companies in the U.S. were impacted by wildfires. California, Oregon, Washington State. Next slide. Here's San Francisco. I think that really made the news when it was turned all orange from the wildfire there in 2020. Next slide. Smoke from the western U.S. wildfires up into New York City. So research, of course, suggests that smoke may be more toxic as it travels and the longer it stays in the air, as it reacts with sunlight and other airborne molecules. And we'll talk a little bit about ground level ozone that is created with that and some of the harms that do to health. Next slide, please. And it's not only here in the United States. This slide shows a farmer in Syria who had 400 acres of wheat, and now it's all desert because of the drought. So in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria is known for its violence that has captured our attention for a long time. However, we should pay more attention to some of the climate-related drought, which was one of the worst they've seen in recent decades. This wheat farmer lost all his land because of that. Next slide. And because of that, and then go one more slide, I think there's more graphics, yeah. So in fact, before the civil war in Syria ever started, we saw this climate-related drought destroy 60% of the farmland in Syria, turning it into a desert land. They lost 80% of their goats, 80% of their livestock. And we saw 1.5 million people driven from the farming areas of Syria into the cities, colliding with others who were already there, some refugees from the Iraq war as well. And it helped to ignite some of the conflict that we saw in some of the cities of Syria. So because of this, driving people into places that they can make a living rather than the land they had, which was no longer inhabitable. Next slide. And this is just the Syrian minister stated publicly that economic social fallout from the drought was beyond our capacity as a country to deal with. And there may have been some influence and some consequence of what we see in the civil strife they've had in Syria, because people have had to move into cities, into already crowded cities. Next slide. This is a photo in 2015 of what happened in Croatia. The great burden of that refugee flow was shouldered by neighboring countries like Jordan, for example, when they have the conflict in Croatia. Poor people are desperately trying to get into a train. This has caused a lot of disruption in the political equilibrium in many countries in Europe, because people having to leave their country because of the drought conditions or flooding conditions or disasters. And certainly it has contributed to that awakening of xenophobia that we've been seeing throughout the world. Next slide. In the future, the climate in large parts of Middle East, North Africa could render some regions uninhabitable, which will surely contribute to the pressure to migrate. And I think it's important to note that in San Antonio, we are accepting migration from many different countries, recently, of course, from Afghanistan. But if you think about people coming from Central America too, certainly this issues that are happening, the changes that are happening to land because of climate change are contributing to that influx as well. Next slide, please. Many parts of the tropics, home to 3 billion people, will experience an unlivable heat and humidity. Next slide. This was a startling statistic. Globally, 2019, 10.3 million people were displaced by extreme weather. From September 20 to February 21 to 2021, it was 24 million, 4 times that, more than created by a conflict, was because of extreme weather events. Next slide. And I think for us, because we live here in San Antonio, South Texas, and we're near the border, you can see here in Central America and what's called the dry corridor, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and then people migrating into Mexico and the United States because of inhabitable land. They cannot make a living, they cannot farm, they cannot ranch in their areas, so they are moving. So climate change, I think from this, climate change is also creating some of that migration that we're seeing. And as many of us care for an immigrant population, I think we do have to consider that trauma of moving from your home to another place and its mental health impacts, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Okay, next slide. Farmer in Honduras. Corn, coffee, beans, can't make enough to feed my family. We've had a lot of droughts. We've had floods. We're headed to Houston asking God to guide us and protect us. This is a farmer in Honduras. This was in May of 2021. Next slide. Guatemala refugees going into Chiapas in Mexico. That 2020 hurricane season that we talked about before, it drove 10,000 additional migrants now northward out of Central America. Next slide. So I want to, we're coming up to 10:45. I'll give us a bit of a break before I then really get into the in-depth of the health impacts. But I wanted to show this graphic that I was able to pull out from this global change website. So if you see those things that are driving the climate on the top of the box, your increased temperatures, extreme weather events, precipitation, sea level rising, intense heat. Those are drivers of what's changing in our climate. It's exposing us to different things: extreme heat, air pollution, air quality is an issue, reduced food and water quality and quantity. If you think about some of the land that is no longer can be farmed. Changes in infectious agents, there's going to be population displacement, which we made a case for as well. And then you put all these social context within it, in your environment and in your social and behavioral context, what we call the social determinants of health. All these health outcomes we see because of that. There are heat-related illnesses, cardiopulmonary illnesses, food, water, vector disease, and then, of course, mental health consequences that are coming from that. So that kind of just sets it up for the next part of the workshop, where we're going to really focus in on health and the impacts that we see. I think we see on a day-to-day basis, and sometimes we don't necessarily think they're climate related. And it's important to understand the connections to the climate and then help our students understand that connection too as they look at some of these health outcomes. Since now that we've had some of the background science consequences of a warming climate, we've been getting regular reports from a lot of different reputable agencies, such as Lancet and physician groups, that said now it's a very serious health threat to the world, public health threat to the world. And so this slide shows you that web that is created, can be created, that has impacts on diseases, has impact on health. Heat stress, air pollution, mental disorders, vector, food, waterborne diseases are all exacerbated by the changing climate. And of course, these related health impacts disproportionately threaten lower income communities, people of color, communities of color, immigrants, elderly, children, people with pre-existing medical conditions, as well as people with existing mental illness as well. So I want to talk about some of these more in depth. Next slide, please. There's your web. Thank you. And first one, let's talk about air pollution. How does it affect health? We're going to look at all of them, as I said, differently, but let's start with air pollution. So when fossil fuels are burned, this methane and carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, like I said, whether it's any one of those, the principal global warming pollution comes from that. But at the same time, that same combustion creates conventional air pollutants like nitrogen oxides and the small particulate air matter. That's what we're really concerned about, is that small particulate air matter, nitrous oxides, that combine in the air to create some of the air pollution that we've been seeing more and more prevalent in many cities across the globe. Pollution from extracting, burning fossil fuel isn't only driving the climate crisis, it's creating this public environmental health issue that is created because of air pollution. Next slide, please. If you look at this slide, it's for the whole world, looking at death that have been attributed to ambient air pollution. Ambient air pollution, pollution that's everywhere in the air, ambient. As the Lancet said, this map shows the areas that are suffering from the worst impact from death created by this air pollution. The redder the country, the more serious the threat. It exposes people to these small particulate matters which impact the lungs and either stay in the lungs or they get into the bloodstream. These small particulate matters causing not only issues with respiratory illness and respiratory disease, but also cardiovascular disease because this small particulate matter gets absorbed into the blood. And we'll talk a bit more about it, but just this air pollution has created many deaths around the world, and many of these deaths are premature and all of them are preventable death. Next slide, please. And of course, this is just a graph showing about the impact. The most vulnerable sometimes are the most impacted. The percentage of Black children in the U.S. suffering from asthma is nearly twice that of white children, and their death rate from asthma is 10 times higher. So in terms of asthma, if you think about, and I know in the nursing curriculum in PD and family health, talk about asthma and asthma in children, it is important to see that one of the exacerbations of asthma is issues around air pollution created by some of these climate change issues. The air pollution contains nitrous oxide, ambient air, all of those things that can be triggering factors for kids with asthma. Next slide, please. In fact, it also causes mental health problems and a decline in cognitive ability as well, air pollution. We have got to change that. Now, a couple of examples that can kind of bring to life the connection between air pollution and health problems. This is a photo of a high school playing outside, and you can see the burning of fossil fuels and that being released into the atmosphere. Air pollution. Let's see, I was going to, coal mining operations contributes to this also, air pollution. Before being burned, coal is washed with water, could be washed in water, chemicals to remove impurities. These are all instances that can create this issues around mental health, cognitive ability, asthma, respiratory illnesses. So really, really important to see the connection between air pollution, that is driven by some of the climate change issues that we've been discussing, and asthma. In San Antonio, we have a significant issue with childhood asthma, as many of you probably are aware because of who you're treating in the clinic and the exacerbations they all have. Dr. Christian Silva, did you have a comment?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, it's okay. But yeah. I thought you may have had a comment about that because I know we
forgot to mute. Sorry.
We are seeing this significant issue with kids that have respiratory illnesses because of air pollution. And remember that asthma is also a contributor to school absenteeism. If you think about children with asthma, particularly in low-income communities, suffering from more exacerbations of asthma, that then connects to their ability to be in school and not be in school and has implications for their academic success as well. So again, all these connections that happen because of these things that might be triggering more exacerbations in asthma, certainly because of the air pollution and the air pollution that is a consequence of some of the things that we're doing in terms of burning fossil fuels and creating that as well. Next slide, please. Pollution exposure during pregnancy has been linked to high blood pressure in children. So again, in utero, we're exposed to ambient air issues. We're exposed to nitrous oxide. then that affects the fetus, and it also has been linked to high blood pressure in children. Next slide. Smoke inhalation from the wildfires causes more hospitalization than other types of air pollution. And again, you've seen the wildfires from the past, and we're just headed into 2021 with many areas still in the United States still under drought conditions. So we see more wildfires, more air pollution, more issues with children, and exacerbation of their existing conditions. Next slide, please. Hearing that in California, more than half of, well, this is a picture in California of pollution, but more than half of the people in the U.S. live in counties that don't meet EPA air quality standards. Is it next slide? If you go next slide. Okay, this is the one I wanted to just spend a little bit of time on because it's local. So here in San Antonio, we have been listed by EPA as one of the top cities for green buildings. So those buildings that are sustainable, that burn less fossil fuels, that are more efficient. However, San Antonio has been also designated by the EPA as being out of attainment in terms of ground level ozone. This was upheld, this EPA ruling was upheld by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in 2020. And in 2021, because of readings, air monitor readings here in San Antonio, particularly the one in Camp Bullis, which still shows us not decreasing our level of ground level ozone, the EPA is getting ready to designate us as being in moderate. We were in we were minimally out of compliance before, and now EPA is getting ready to say we're moderately out of compliance, which is going to have an impact on a lot of different things. Certainly health, and the health of our children and their most vulnerable certainly will be impacted, but it's also going to have an impact on funding and whether San Antonio will receive federal funding. They're going to need to get this issue under control. And this on the right-hand side shows you a graph of when we talk about ground level ozone, what we mean by that. So there's two types of ozone. The ozone that's up in the atmosphere, that's the good ozone because it does protect us from the intense heat of the sunlight. So you want that there. You do not want ozone near the ground, on the ground. And that is where we're out of compliance in San Antonio, is that level of ozone on the ground. And this is created through sunlight mixing with nitrogen oxide and volatile organic compounds. And so it becomes a toxic soup that stays on the ground and becomes ozone. And that's when you hear about the ground level ozone alert days. And this is when they recommend decreasing your driving, not putting gas in the car during the day at the heat of the sun, because that's just contributing to what's already out there. And the vehicle smog, vehicle emissions, gas emissions, and then intense sunlight and intense heat in the atmosphere all contribute to that ground level ozone. So in terms of our curriculum, in terms of giving nursing students some idea of what ground level ozone is and why it's so dangerous, and how that we can try to minimize our exposure to that, as well as people who will be vulnerable to that, the elderly, the respiratory compromised, communities of color, the infants, etc. So that's that ground level ozone, which has a tremendous impact on health, particularly respiratory health. Next slide, please. And a little bit of what ozone does in the airway. Ozone gets into the respiratory tract and it causes inflammation. So if you can think of what happens in asthma in our body, it is contributing to more and more of that inflammation. So the symptoms are going to be your cough, sore or scratchy throat, pain with deep breathing and fatigue. And this is a rapid onset of this exacerbation. And certainly with asthma, the symptoms can be of greater intensity. It also occurs, of course, in people without asthma too, because it is an irritant to the lungs, to causing that inflammation. And when it does reach those unhealthy levels, that's when it becomes that that alert days, those alert days that we hear about. Next slide, please. So this study in 2016 alone, this is something that I wasn't aware of, but there seems to be an association. So the study found that air pollution contributed to 3.2 million new diabetes cases, 14% of the total around the world. In the United States, air pollution was linked to 150,000 new cases of diabetes per year. And so in this study, which I did put a link into that, they're talking about rising global temperatures might contribute to the current worldwide diabetes epidemic. And so what this research was speculating, because it's an association, it's not a cause and effect, it's an association. But what this article was speculating, the researchers were speculating, is it because of the metabolism of brown adipose tissue, that air pollution seems to be associated with inability to metabolize the brown adipose tissue and creating some of that glucose intolerance. So again, I say this is an association, but there has been an association between more cases of diabetes and air pollution. So thought, okay, another health impact. And this might be something we consider when we're seeing someone or talking with people about ways to prevent diabetes, or for people with pre-diabetes, is what might be this link between air pollution and diabetes, and then do some more investigation into what they do on a daily basis to understand their exposure to air pollution. Next slide, please. Okay, then heat stress. Next slide. Who is the most vulnerable to the intense heat? And again, what we've been saying all along, the ones with pre-existing medical condition, mentally ill, poor, homeless, elderly, infants and children, but also outside workers, agricultural workers, the most vulnerable to heat. And of course, here in San Antonio, we are very well exposed to heat, and we understand what the dangers of heat, if you will, because of our living here and just having those more intense heat days. But it is also important to remember that those intense heat days cause this heat stress and has a physiological impact to the body, particularly with these most vulnerable to heat. Next slide, please. Impacts of rising temperatures on health, more frequent heat waves, we've seen that, and the urban heat island effect. It's important to know with urban heat, and what we're talking about is the amount of concrete that you have, that built environment, that amount of concrete. And when there's a lot of concrete, that retains heat. Instead of bouncing off heat, it retains heat. So everything around that concrete is even hotter than the heat wave, than the intense heat. So the urban heat island. So we have to think about this more and more and more when we think about living in urban cities, how much concrete there is. And think about Houston. If you're familiar with Houston, many times Houston is just a whole bunch of concrete. And the problem with that is that it also retains heat. So you think about the atmosphere retaining heat, and then where you're living can retain heat because of the amount of concrete around that. So it increases dehydration and also heat stroke. It certainly can exaggerate any cardiovascular disease, respiratory illnesses. Daily temperatures and humidity are currently life-threatening for 30% of the globe. This is projected to increase between 48 to 47% by the year 2100. So as you see here, just some graphics here about intense heat, rising temperatures, and how it impacts, and then leading to dehydration, heat stroke, cardiovascular problems, and respiratory illnesses. Next slide. India in 2019, that ongoing heat wave triggered an outbreak of encephalitis, killing over 120 children. So again, the connection to the association with the intense heat wave, and then encephalitis because of that. Next slide. This is just a graph that shows you last year when that terrible heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, just the increase in hospitalizations during that time for numerous reasons. But you saw the spike there with the heat wave, people having to go into the hospital to help manage that. Next slide. And then agricultural workers. This picture shows something in California, but here in Texas, it's the same thing. Agricultural workers are actually 35 times more likely to die from heat-related illnesses than the general population. So important thinking about when we do our education for our patients, for our clients that may be agricultural workers, being sure that they are aware and they're educated about protecting themselves from the heat, what they should be wearing, what they should be drinking, how often they should be drinking, but also think of the urban heat island contributing even more. So construction workers, the concrete all around them. So not only the heat from the atmosphere from the heat wave, but also from the concrete. So even more of an impact to agricultural workers as well as construction workers. Next slide, please. Here's in Arizona, a picture in Arizona 2017, non-citizen immigrants in the U.S. have more than 3 times the risk of dying from heat-related illnesses. Okay, next slide. And then in terms of putting this in the curriculum, I'm being sure that our nursing students understand what heat stroke is and dehydration and in the importance of that issue when we have a heat wave going on and people suffering that. So heat stroke is a loss of that internal temperature control that's increased in vulnerable populations. Those taking some high blood pressure medicines and certainly psychiatric medications as well. So they're more at risk for heat stroke. In 1995 Chicago heat wave, 739 deaths happened in 5 days during this heat wave. And then, of course, dehydration, and certainly dehydration, as we all know, can lead to kidney failure. So again, important for nursing students to make that connection. Next slide. Cardiovascular, respiratory illnesses. It exacerbates, of course, existing chronic issues. No big surprise here. Cardiac dysrhythmias and congestive heart failure. And warmer temperatures also increase smog. Again, that ground level ozone, reduced air quality, and has a negative impact on people with COPD and asthma. So heat can exacerbate those things that air pollution, ground level ozone does, and can contribute to that as well. Next slide. And I think before we leave intense heat, I wanted to just take a moment to put, I just put this slide in this morning because of the issue about plastics, intense heat, and epigenetics. I talked with students a little bit about this in population health, but as we all know, there's chemicals in our plastic that makes it pliable. It's flexible because of that. One of the better known ones that we know of is BPA, but DEHP and DBP. And again, these are chemicals that are important to make it pliable and flexible in plastics, but these chemicals are known as endocrine disrupting chemicals, which means they can alter the DNA. They can alter DNA. They're epigenetics, what we call epigenetics. So they're endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in plastic because of these chemicals, and they have these epigenetic tendencies. And this is transgenerational. So what you may be exposed to it, and it may not have an impact on you, but it will have on your offspring and your children and their children as well. So it's what we call epigenetic. So the thing about these these endocrine disrupting chemicals, if they are in plastic and they are exposed to intense heat, either through microwaving, a hot car, being outside, those chemicals are going to be released into that food product or the liquid in the bottle or the microwave plastic container that you expose to intense heat. So important to think about how we educate our patients, our clients, our nursing students about how we reduce exposure to this endocrine disrupting chemical, particularly for women of childbearing age, men for contraception. I mean, men and their contribution to birth as well, because they could carry these epigenetic chemicals in their sperm, and that can expose the woman and then therefore expose the fetus to that. So I was just wanting to add this in there because it's another issue about with intense heat. When you expose the plastic to it, those chemicals can seep into the food or the liquids that we drink. So don't leave your plastic bottle in the car in the summer or anytime in the car and then drink it because of that intense heat that creates those chemicals in the fluid. So wanted to just highlight this here. Okay, next slide, please. And then this is just something I got off the CDC, but there's everything. There's a lot of different resources out there, and it's important to educate our students as they go into nursing, is what to look for when it comes to heat stroke, heat exhaustion, heat cramp, sunburn, heat rash, the differences between what to look for and then what to do. So there's a lot of these types of this information out here. But I think particularly in San Antonio and South Texas, we need to be sure that our nursing students recognize this and the heat-related issues, because we're going to see these more severe heat waves. And it's important for all of us as health professionals to understand the importance of acting quickly to avoid going into heat stroke. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then one of our favorites as well, I'm going to talk about allergens. South Texas, how many of us suffer from allergies, issues in the environment? And lo and behold, this has a connection to climate change as well. Next slide. So allergies are expected to be worse by 2040. Some people don't have to worry about this. Go ahead to the next slide. I think it's another graphic coming in. Yeah. That some people, of course, don't have to worry about this, but those that suffer from it, you can talk to them about the fact that the projected increase is from 8,000 to 8,500 grains of pollen per cubic meter, which was in 2000. In 2040, there are expected to be more cubic grains of pollen in pollen. So pollen is actually going to become more intense. So there is a with the warming climate. What we're starting to see, what is starting to be seen, is these grains of pollen become much larger and contain much more pollen. So they become much more intense. So a connection with allergies and the severity of asthma and the warming climate. Next slide. So as you talk to people with respiratory allergies, the importance of understanding increased temperature, what that increased temperature is going to have, the effect it's going to have on the environment, increased plant and mold growth, contributing to mold, ragweed allergies. It's going to be a longer season because the air is warmer. They tend to grow more in warmer climates, and a shift in flowering times. So you're going to have more allergens in the air, increased pollen, increased mold. We have a lot of mold here in San Antonio, but it's going to create worse symptoms relative to respiratory allergies, but also it's going to be asthma triggers as well. Next slide. And people will be affected. Exposure to allergens, days out sick, again, thinking about school and kids being out of school, but also work. So your ragweed season increased an average of 18 days in between 95 and 2015. Current fossil fuel emissions will increase pollen by 60 to 100% by 2085. So it's going to exacerbate the asthma. 4 million missed our low productivity days because of exposure to mold. And again, that's one significant area we have here in San Antonio, that is that increase in mold. Next slide. Higher pollen levels have coincided with higher rates of COVID-19 cases, even in people with no pollen allergies. So just connecting it to what's going on right now during the pandemic. Next slide. Okay, and infectious diseases. So we talked about heat stroke, we talked about air pollution, we talked about the allergens. Now we're going to be talking about infectious diseases. Next slide. So a quote here: climate change is disrupting the natural ecosystems in a way that is making life better for infectious diseases. Next slide. So as climate changes and humans expand further into the Earth's remaining wild places, or the rainforest or the green spaces, 5 new infectious diseases on average are emerging on average each year. This is a big one because the climate crisis is changing the relationship between human beings and the microbial forms of life and the pathogens that cause infectious diseases. So humans are going into places where there had not been human activity before and the buildup of the environment. In fact, scholars say that climate change is disrupting the natural ecosystems in a way that's good for these diseases to flourish. Climate has always mediated that relationship, and now that the climate is changing because of human activity, it's getting much warmer, and it's disrupting these microbial and creating more opportunity for infectious diseases to be created, as well as to flourish. Next slide, please. 75% of all new emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, meaning they are transmitted from animals to humans. Now, this is important right now because of COVID-19 and the speculation that it came from bats to human beings. Actually, 75% or 3/4 of all new infectious diseases are coming from animals to humans. And it's connected to our intrusion into these formerly wild areas where there were millions of viruses, for example, that human beings had never encountered before. So again, now changing climates, humans moving in, rainforest and everything, the trees being cut down, and humans creeping into areas where they had not been before exposes them to things they had not been exposed to before, and creating some of those diseases. So if you have an interest in infectious diseases, this is certainly an impact that climate change is creating in terms of increasing our exposure to these things. Next slide. And this is a slide that just shows tropical diseases on the move. And this highlights that they're moving poleward and moving in the northern hemisphere to areas where people don't have the kind of resistance that's been built up over generations. Some of this is due to airline travel, of course, and globalization, and that does spread it, but the conditions are changing in ways that expand the areas where these formerly tropical diseases became endemic, and they would take root. People would have more resilience to them, but now because of the warming climate, these tropical diseases are moving northward, and we're becoming exposed to them and don't have that same resistance to them. Next slide. This is a map of the United States that shows disease cases from mosquitoes. We all are familiar with mosquitoes, of course, here in San Antonio. The top mosquito-borne disease in Texas in 2016 was the West Nile virus, 906 mosquito-borne cases. Then we had the top tick-borne disease was fever ricketosis. And Chakra's disease, transmitted by a kissing bug, has been identified in immigrants from Central and South America. It is considered one of those neglected parasitic infections. But fleas can also carry the Yersinia pestis bacterium, which causes plague. We do have occasional outbreaks of plague as well. But you can see from this that the mosquitoes are moving northward, if you will. The ticks are moving northward. Other things are moving northward. And the result is those infections that are arising because of this. Next slide. So causes of increased vector-borne diseases are the rising global temperatures, increased rainfall, flooding, humidity, and then human migration. No immunity to new diseases, because human migration may be bringing in these diseases to populations that don't have the immunity. And then, of course, a population that's migrating may not have immunity to something that's endemic in the place they're migrating to. So vector-borne illnesses and diseases are something we're going to see increased because of climate change impacts. Next slide. One that we looked at, we saw Zika virus, and that was a few years ago, a couple of years ago, that we had an epidemic of Zika virus. Because of the increased heat and humidity, the mosquitoes had a longer breeding season, increased geographic range. So it was getting warmer. So it was nice for those mosquitoes to come up north because it was just as warm. And that there was a faster replication of the pathogens because of the intense heat, the warmer temperature. The mosquitoes worked harder to replicate the same pathogen. And so one of the things that resulted from it is microcephaly, and that may be related to Zika virus. And so this is just a graphic showing that issue of microcephaly. Next slide. And this is just a graph showing how you go on, Beth, because this is going to filter in the red ones, the red bullets. Yeah. And it shows that climate change and how it does affect Zika. So again, like I said, the range expands more northward. There are more days when the mosquitoes are active and able to reproduce because there's more warmer days. Mosquitoes' reproduction rate increases, and metabolism increases, and it incubates more quickly. The virus incubates more quickly in the mosquito, increasing the time available for transmission. So again, another impact of climate change to our health. Next slide, please. And waterborne infectious diseases, cholera, dysentery, hepatitis A, typhoid, E. coli. Hepatitis A is an important one because we see more and more of hepatitis A coming because of things that are filtering into our waters, those waterborne infections, those viruses and bacteria that live in water not being filtered out and creating this situation for more hepatitis A and E. coli. And I think we've all heard of some of the recent E. coli outbreaks that we've had, food having been taken off the shelves, out of some of the fast food restaurants, etc., because of these waterborne infectious diseases. Next slide. So the last one I want to talk about is mental health impacts. I think it's important to think about mental health impacts because we touched upon it in all the different areas, but want to stay a little bit of time on those disaster-related impacts of climate change. So those hurricanes, those intense rain events, those tornadoes, and what we just saw in Kentucky in December. Very, very suddenly have we heard of tornadoes in December. This was in December, and it was so out of the norm to have a tornado, but the intensity of it. So you think about all those things that create those disasters that climate change creates and impacts, and think about post-traumatic stress syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder. a lot of times of course, it's really, really impactful when we think about veterans and PTSD in there, but think about PTSD when it comes to people who have experienced a disaster, particularly for people in low-income areas or that might not have the resiliency with the resources around them to start their life over again. So, limited home insurance or limited health insurance. They were renting and not buying, and other factors that contributed to their lack of resilience to overcome a disaster like that. And so the PTSD that results from disasters is very, very significant. So it's important not to think about it just from the veteran standpoint, but it's important for students to think about PTSD from any traumatizing event, and certainly disasters are one of those. This National Center had a statistic. Hurricane Katrina reported PTSD, survivors reported PTSD up to 2 years after the event. So post-traumatic stress syndrome becomes more and more frequent. But anxiety, and just think about anxiety. I mean, we live in an anxious time anyway, particularly now with the pandemic. Everybody is anxious, but even before that, I mean, we just we're in a very anxious, anxiety-prone environment. And again, disasters on top of that just increase that anxiety even more so. And then, of course, depression. The people at risk for mental health impacts are these that we've seen with all this workshop and this presentation: children, elderly women, especially pregnant postpartum women, pre-existing mental disorders. Again, just think about the impact of a disaster when I'm already suffering from bipolar disease or PTSD for another reason, depression. First responders, again, we don't necessarily always give this enough attention, but the issues of what first responders to these disasters and the impact it can have on them and their mental health and stability. Economically disadvantaged, the homeless, communities that rely on the natural environment. So if this natural environment is destroyed during a disaster, again, think about that mental health impact it would have on them. They have to migrate. They have to come to a new home. They have to disrupt their whole way of life. So again, impacts that the issues around climate change can have on these most at-risk populations. Next slide. So many people who will experience adverse mental health outcomes and social impacts from climate change, the perceived direct experience of climate change and changes to one's local environment. Media, popular culture, representations of climate change influence stress responses, mental health, and well-being. So don't want to give a short shift to mental health outcomes because of these disasters that people will have experienced and will be continuing to experience. I remember, and Dr. Saul, in Rockport, I believe there were some children, parents talking about children that experienced some post-traumatic stress syndrome, and that hearing loud noises, hearing thunder again, and they're reliving some of the experience they had being in Rockport when Hurricane Katrina met. And some of these impacts, some of these mental health impacts were interrupting their schooling, their academic success, etc. Dr. Salt, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, they write children's books about surviving natural disaster, and something that the parents shared is that the kids lost their friends, everything that they had known, their school. A lot of people had to relocate and leave, and that seemed to be something that was quite upsetting, understandably, to the little kiddos.
Yeah, exactly. And I think and particularly in San Antonio, because San Antonio has created a climate action and adaptation plan, as we think about how we're going to prepare our buildings for the coming climate change, how we're going to prepare our roads, and how we're going to prepare the concrete. San Antonio is experimenting with painting concrete that does not retain heat. So there's a paint, a white paint that now they're experimenting with putting over concrete, so they don't create this urban heat. So as we prepare more, we need to include mental health issues in that, because mental health and having the infrastructure to deal with the mental health impacts from some of those disasters we know will happen will help our community continue flourishing. But we also have to develop that infrastructure, which San Antonio needs to continue doing in their disaster planning. So just wanted to emphasize that, because many of us talk about disaster planning in our courses and think about how mental health fits into that as well. Next slide, please. And as we end today, I wanted to give you some resources that you might be able to use in your work with students in your classes, in your clinicals. First of all, like I said, San Antonio has a document now called SA Climate Ready, and this is our action and adaptation plan. So this is the plan of how San Antonio will adapt their buildings, their infrastructure, their green spaces, everything to meet the challenges they know that will be coming from climate change. It's important to know that there is in San Antonio, that San Antonio is working on the fact that there are vulnerable people during these intense heat waves, and they have a project called Project Cool. Dr. Sol?
Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. My cat was acting up.
It's called Project Cool, and it's every year people donate fans, and they deliver box fans to fans to people in the community that are most vulnerable to these heat waves. And being out in the community, I know that people and everybody that's that works in the community can say this, that people will not turn on their air conditioning because of how it's going to increase their utility bills. And now we all see that CPS has raised rates. So this is going to have even more of an impact on people making the decision whether to turn on their air conditioning or not. And this Project Cool is something that can help with fan delivery. So identifying those people in the community and getting those fans that they need. Also, CPS Energy has a program called Casa Verde. And this is a program where people that are income eligible and has a home that's eligible that is not weatherized to issues relative to climate change, intense heat, air pollution, they will subsidize their weatherization of their homes, putting strips on their doors, strips on their windows, etc., to help the efficiency of the energy use within the home. And so that's Casa Verde, and people can apply for that. And if they're income eligible for that, they can get help with weatherizing their home, which certainly helps the most vulnerable during these intense events because of climate change. Next slide, please. And two other things. San Antonio always opens up cooling centers, more so cooling centers than heating centers, although they do open up heating centers for those times that we do have intense cold, like on, I believe Thursday is going to be one of those cold days. But the cooling centers are always available, and this link is shows you a map of where the cooling centers are. There are libraries, there are some community centers, other city buildings that are used for cooling centers where people can go to, or where they can get the bus to take them, again, for the people that are most vulnerable. And then I just wanted to also leave you with this community agency called SA Kids Breathe. It's funded through the city, and this is a program that uses the community health worker model to help parents and caregivers and children manage their asthma better. And they do take referrals. So anybody in the community, nurse practitioners that have kids with asthma that need some help with managing that, they can refer the child and their parents to SA Kids Breathe. A community health worker will go into their home and work with them to identify allergens within the community, within their home that might be exacerbating the issue, as well as Casa Verde to weatherize their home and work with them to help better manage that asthma. And one thing for you when you're talking to nursing students or nurse practitioner students about issues around asthma, one of the things that SA Kids Breathe is finding in their evaluation of the project is that most people that are managing a child with asthma, that have a child with asthma, did not understand how to use the medicine correctly, the inhalers and other medications, and it was more of a health literacy issue. So just want to pass that information on, that this is what this community health worker model is finding that people are telling them, and when they demonstrate how they use the medication and the inhalers, they're finding that they did not understand how to use it appropriately. And that is one way that now they're helping better manage that. So just something to take, that we really, really need to pay attention to how we're educating people on this issue in controlling and managing their asthma, because if they do have asthma, they are certainly more at risk with changes in the climate. Okay, so next slide, please. And then just wanted to leave you with these two resources. There is a national organization called the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. They have a website, environ.org, has a lot of great resources that you can use in your curriculum, that you can use in any kind of presentations that you do on this issue. So it's a wealth of information about health impacts of climate change. And then, of course, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, same thing. They have a wealth of information relative to climate change issues. So just wanted to leave you with those two resources. And then I just wanted to remind, as we end today, I'm going to end today with a video. And well, I'll come back on after the video. Beth, or do you have to end it before we go to the video, or can you keep us on? You're going to keep us on Teams, right?
Sorry, when I'm presenting it is difficult. Yes, we can do the video, and then I'll stop presenting. Yes, ma'am.
Well, let me ask right before we do the video. Let me ask if there's any questions. And I'm sorry, I did not see. Did I miss any of the chat box? Or any questions? Anything at all? I hope some information that you can use as you're planning your semester and previous semesters. If there's any information on the slides that you need, it's a fairly big slide. I mean, it uses a lot, so not able to send it through email, but I can certainly talk with each and every one of you if there's anything that you would like to see again. Dr. Christian Silva.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Algelita. That was an amazing presentation. Unfortunately, not a lot of it is new to me because I've been interested in this topic for a long time, but yeah, it was just so well presented. And I just wanted to share that I, for a long time have felt quite overwhelmed with climate change and not knowing what I personally can do to make a difference, or and so I've really been trying to make small changes in my life. We have an electric car, and but one of the things I've gone to recently and I've been involved in personally and professionally is I've gone to a plant-based diet completely, and as most of you know, been involved with Heidi Benavides and Christiana Morales, and we've started a new program out of Wellness 360 called the Green Wellness Program. And it's a plant-based whole foods nutrition and wellness program designed to help people with chronic disease management and prevention. And it's so it's mostly to help people with their health, but I've also come to really appreciate how much moving towards a plant-based diet can impact the environment and climate change. And I don't know, I just wanted to mention that it's given me a little bit of solace to feel like I am spreading the word on that. And in addition to all of the other efforts that you have talked about. So hopefully, so I just wanted to share that's
Thank you.
that's something important to me that I felt I could make a small difference.
Right. And, I mean, climate change, I did not want to get into it with this workshop, but advocacy and the issues around advocacy, and just like what you're doing is talking to us about this plant-based diets and talking to our patients and our clients about that as well. Goes a long way with this.
I also teach health policy, and I am amazed how many of our students in the graduate program, at least, are very much interested in fighting climate change. And a lot of they choose a health policy topic, and several of them chose issues around climate change and closing our coal-fired power plants and other climate-related issues. So, it's their future and their children's future that are really at stake here. So
I'd like to see CPS Energy close those two plants down a lot earlier.
Yeah. But thank you. And thank you for all your work in sharing this message.
Thank you so much. Dr. Grubasek.
Yeah, I think this is great. I really think that the important thing is that we get the message out, and getting it to our nursing students early at the undergraduate level is so important. So I love this. Thank you so much. I just wanted to put a plug in. I had suggested for the CSL topic this year to be on the topic of climate change. And the topic we have this year is awesome. It's also a very needed topic on the displaced youth, but I'm definitely pushing for next year. So I know that about 3 or 4 of you on this webinar are also involved with CSL. So maybe we can get the entire school to get involved by having it be the CSL topic next year.
And it might be interesting to put it with the migrant issue that is created by climate as well.
Absolutely. Our populations, I mean, everything that you talked about, health and all of our vulnerable populations, that's who we're taking care of, right? When we're doing service learning. So the connection is there.
That connection is there. Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Grubasek. Anyone else? All right. I'm going to go ahead and end it with this video. I hope that you find it very inspirational. And then, as Beth was saying, there will be a follow-up. Beth will send the California Nurse Association your names and email addresses. The 5 questions will be sent to you, and then you will get a certificate for the continuing education credits. So thank you so much for your attention today. I really, really enjoyed being able to interact with you, and certainly the topic will continue, and glad to see there are so many people who are interested in this. So Beth, let me turn it over to you to get the video going. It's about 4 minutes, but again, I think you'll find it inspiring. There's no volume, Beth.
I can hear the volume on my end, but you're not hearing it? Okay.
No.
Maybe if I don't mute, let's see. What? Oh my goodness.
Let's see. I'm not hearing it. Did anybody else hear it?
No, I don't have any sound.
Okay.
Dr. Cantu, I put a link in there. If the sound doesn't come up, would it be possible to get the link and we could just watch it?
Yes, I think so.
I don't understand why it's not. That's the one thing we didn't test, Dr. Cantu. I didn't think about it. It was working. Um,
Can you just share your screen, Beth,
mhm.
and then do it that way, maybe? Do the same link. Okay, still don't hear it.
I'm trying to share there. I'm sharing the link. Maybe we can all follow together and I can play it. I'm so sorry. I don't understand why it's not playing. You're on mute, Dr. Cantu. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. Can everybody access it on their own or their from the chat? I should say.
Yes, we can watch it.
Okay.
I've had this problem before with Teams. For some reason, the videos don't play, or they play, but you don't get any sound.
They're not playing with us today. Okay. Well, this is a video. It's called Earthrise, and Amanda Gordon, who is a poet, a young poet, and I know she was recently did a poem at the inauguration, and she did this a couple of years back, and I think it's just a very inspirational video about issues around climate change and the advocacy that we need to do behind it. Dr. Christensen Silva talked about that. So everybody's watching it on.
Okay, I'll let it play while everybody listens along on their end.
Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you're on it. Yeah, okay, good. Dr. Salt, yeah. Okay, Beth, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I got kicked off of Teams, so I was just, yeah, okay. So,
Oh, no.
yeah, I'm not sure, but I just wanted to say I found it very inspirational. I use this a lot, video, just to kind of help us understand the importance of it and who is really the most vulnerable as well. Dr. Links, what do you think are the best sources for energy production? The best sources, you mean in terms of being more sustainable, certainly electrical vehicles, but you've got the wind and solar, your alternative energy sources. There's a lot of positive things being done with nuclear energy right now. I'm not quite sure that I would advocate yet, because I don't think the science is there yet, where they talk about capturing of the carbon caption from these coal burning plants. So I think the more sustainable ones are the ones that I think have the most promise. And there's a lot of work being done in development of batteries as well as storage. How do you think about storing solar energy or storing solar power? So I think right now those are the ones that are really getting the most investment in, because those are the most sustainable.
Yeah, thanks. I just know we had some issues with some of the solar potentially, especially northern climates where they just don't get very much sun. Having
Right.
grown up in Chicago, I know that we didn't get a lot of sun, so solar would have been an issue. So I just wondered where we were at with that, because I know there's a real challenge still with some of the wind and solar options.
Right. And I think, with more investment in understanding and developing mechanisms to store that, we would be able to store and then transfer energy to different places like Chicago, where they don't have a lot of sun. Those are certainly our most sustainable, if you will. And just traveling down to the valley, how many wind turbines we have, and it's just such a prime area for that. But you do need a way to store all that energy as well.
Right. Thanks. This was an incredible presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, I apologize for the video, but I'm hoping that everybody got to see that. The link is in the chat box. Phil, it's a YouTube video, so feel free to use that if you feel a need, or for your students. And I do appreciate your participation today and the interaction. Anything I can do to be of assistance, let me know. Everyone have a great afternoon, and be safe out there, please, please, please. Bye-bye, everybody.